an artist and a professor at UB. I teach in emerging media forms. And for those of you who don't know, emerging media forms are those which have not yet become expected or accepted means of expression nor communication. Emerging media forms have allowed me to address implications of new technologies critically, but also reflexively, using the very same technologies as a medium. So for example, in the 1990s, as AI algorithms were being developed to covertly capture and analyze all our personal data, I was making interactive computer artworks that made these processes visible and highlighted their biases. By the mid-90s, however, many of the most disturbing technologies were biotechnological, or rather, technology had invaded the body, and the field of biology seemed to have become a subset of engineering. For instance, this is an image from the National Library of Medicine called the Visible Human Project, which was a digital data set of 2,000 slices of an actual inmate who was executed in Texas in 1995. Though he's dead, his body can be viewed like an animation or played like a deck of cards. And if that doesn't strike you as odd, here is something called the Vacante Mouse. It was created in the Harvard lab in 1996 by growing cow cartilage cells in the shape of a human ear, which was then transplanted onto the back of the mouse, which had been engineered without an immune system, so that it was able to live for several days without rejecting the foreign tissue. Neat, huh? These biotechnologies were advancing rapidly, yet there is not a corresponding advancement in our ethics or aesthetics. So around 2000, I started a series of critical artistic interventions into biotechnology, creating my first biomedia artworks with DNA, scientific tools in my own DIY studio lab. And now I run a center at UB dedicated to just this very endeavor. Here's the center. The Coalesce Center for Biological Art responds to what I describe as a grand challenge to our social, cultural, and ethical tools developed through the 20th century, challenged by recent advances in the life sciences. Coalesce is a hybrid studio laboratory dedicated to enabling hands-on creative engagement with the tools and technologies of the life sciences. It's a place where artists, designers, and architects actively learn and explore these techniques, a place where scientists explore the ethics or broader cultural meanings of their work, and philosophers, writers, and social scientists have an embodied engagement with these processes. So now that you know a bit about me, let me tell you a little story about the latest project. All right, biophilia. The theme of this week is biophilia, which is a term coined by biologist E.O. Wilson, referring to a desire or a tendency to commune with nature. Biophilia is an engagement with living creatures ethically and on equal terms, which is the antithesis of treating them like tools or technology. It's fitting to be selected for this theme because the artwork I'm presenting here was actually developed at a place called Biophilia, the Center for Biological Arts in Helsinki, Finland, which had invited me to spend the semester of the spring of 2014 there. And if this center sounds a lot like the one I direct, Coalesce, it's because Coalesce was modeled upon it, and especially its big sister, Symbiotica, a laboratory in Perth, Australia, which was really the first of this kind. It opened in 2002, and I think I visited there in 2005 or something. Our three centers now form a sort of network of such places across the world. So, deciding what to actually do in Finland. First, I had to actually figure out some of the things I wanted to be doing in Finland. And I realized I wanted to spend a lot of time in the sauna and maybe teach workshops in them, which seemed transgressive enough. I'd previously done this project in the Canadian Rockies called Deep Woods PCR. And in that project, I used a campfire as a DIY DNA thermocycler. Just to unpack without going into too much detail, it's a really fancy way of amplifying DNA. So anyways, I figured I could do the same in the sauna. Whoa, look, behold. But this is when I started thinking about sweat and sweating. My thoughts raced to a lot of the biologically interesting things about sweat. One, humans are relatively unique as animals who sweat through their skin. Apes and horses also do. Sweat in itself is odorless, but it's the microbes on our skin which give it its funky aroma, and this is really important. The human microbiome is fascinating, as it had recently been found that we actually have more bacterial cells in and on our body than human ones. This was what some people have called becoming post-human when we realized this. These microbes, they fill our guts, they enable digestion, as well as our immune reactions, our appetites, our emotional states. Bacteria not only inhabit us, but they codify us. So sweat is deeply tied to the idea of work. Karl Marx wrote about the exploitation of labor as how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow. In sweatshops, as seen here, laborers are referred to as sweaters. Sweat is a byproduct of labor, unwanted and offensive. Human scent is never polite. Indeed, much of our culture is designed to minimize these odors. Deodorants, antiperspirants, perfumes, toothpastes, breath mints, laundry detergents, soaps, room deodorizers, not to mention bathrooms and the modern toilet. So perhaps it's the antithesis of how we think of art, and art appreciation as some kind of like refined good taste, because the artwork I was conceiving would fill a whole room there would be a whole room in which live bacteria were incubated in massive fermentation tanks expressly to produce the scent of human sweat. The smell wouldn't be an unwanted byproduct like in the Victorian factory, but somewhat of a nostalgic end product for human appreciation and sublime contemplation. So it turns out that there are 3 genera of bacteria that produce the aroma of sweat, and they feed up 2 distinct categories of sweat. Staphylococcus epidermidis, kind of a mouthful, primarily inhabit the surface of the skin, metabolizing the watery product of our eccrine sweat glands to create what I consider a mild or athletic smell. I describe this smell as somewhat high-pitched, and I associate it with the perma-stench of locker rooms. Others may have different associations, as this basically humans' ability to distinguish the scent can vary up to about 100 times between individuals. On the other hand, the bacteria Propioni and Corny species mostly metabolize fatty excretions from the apocrine sweat glands, and they create the funky, cheesy, vinegary, rancid odors. This gland produces most in times of anxiety, as well as during sexual arousal. But these processes are really complicated and intertwined, and they produce a kind of aromatic bouquet of a complexity far greater than the sum of their parts. The writer Marlon James, who I have here, really nicely describes these two different human scents in his novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I'll read. He says, Kava is like most men. He carries two smells. One is when the sweat runs down his back and dries, the sweat of hard work. And one hides under the arms, between the legs, between the buttocks, what you smell when you're close enough to touch with lips. The character that is describing these scents is named Tracker. And he's kind of a magical wolf man with superhuman olfactory powers. In my work, I began by spending days with my armpits fully covered in sterile pads, while I performed a bunch of just everyday tasks like writing proposals, responding to emails, some drawing, and other days I'd bike to the Biophilia lab, which was at Alta University, and I carefully removed the pads there. And then I'd soak each pad in saline solution and spread over Petri dishes and incubate. Some dishes were incubated, which just means basically warmed, in regular air, and some under anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic simply means without oxygen, which is a way of mimicking the conditions inside our skin, which is where the Microbiome bacteria thrive. They actually live between the different layers of human skin where there's no air. Surprisingly, I was able to actually isolate all my microbial collaborators there and get to know how they lived. When I returned to Buffalo, I experimented with different types of nutrients. This is the coalesce lab. I experimented with different types of nutrients to feed the bacteria. One way I was able to keep too many opportunistic bacteria from taking over in the lab was to use really high salt concentrations. Like our bodies, our skin microbiota are really highly tolerant to salt, unlike regular environmental bacteria. I discovered that they can survive on a whole variety of nutrients, but I had to be really careful, as some of the nutrients allowed the bacteria to use different metabolic paths to digest, which some of them no longer stank, heaven forbid. So I had to design bioreactors that I'll describe later, as well as these like computerized controllers that I could use to maintain the right temperatures and still feed them at the right times, the right things. So
that's so cool.
Oh, thanks. It's good to hear a voice at the other end. I completed this project in 2019. There it is. 5 years after I began it. Here it is installed at the Birchfield Penny Art Gallery right here in Buffalo. The artwork fills the room with the varied scents of sweating bodies, but without people. The scents also vary a lot over time, and they become increasingly pungent over the course of the exhibition. The scents are created by bacteria that are breeding in these, or growing in these different tanks there. You can't see my hand when I do that, can you? In these bioreactors. And the bioreactors are basically like fermenters used for brewing beer, except they're designed to facilitate more types of microbes and more biochemical reactions. Each reactor in this exhibition incubates one of the 3 species of human skin bacteria that are responsible for these smells of sweating bodies: Staphylococcus epidermidis, Corneoserosis, and Propione avidum. Their scents combine in the central glass chamber, which I guess hopefully you can see there, in which there's a hanging white T-shirt, which is infused before the scents sort of fill the room. Good. Labor is like a scientific theater in which audiences experience a microbial performance and a notable human absence. At the absolute center of the installation, connected to a whole radiating network of tubes and cables and such, is an empty white T-shirt hanging in a glass bell jar. So while humans have always been at the center of our worldview, in labor, the human has conspicuously vanished. And it's like a recognition of all the non-human microbes that produce this strange quality that we think of as humanness. So after 5 years now, I guess, of working with skin bacteria, I'm just really beginning to fathom the complexity of human aroma. For instance, while 3 main bacteria may be responsible for the primary scent of sweat, it would be really reductive and overly simplistic to imagine that this is the end of the story. How do they interact with each other and other skin bacteria, even fungal cohabitants of the skin, to produce our smell? Also, unlike most plants and animals, many bacteria have a variety of metabolic options for survival, and each produces different byproducts and different intermediary compounds. It would be like as if a person could be like, oh, am I going to use the Krebs cycle to digest today, or am I going to use photosynthesis? Let me see what my conditions are. Some of these intermediaries that are produced in the processes stink and others don't. And I wondered, is it possible that some of my bacteria stink only under really particular conditions? Like when our nutrients are out of balance, for instance. And this led me to an interesting conundrum. So we've probably all heard it said that like deep human attraction is often premised on how we smell. Like what perfumes aspire to do, bacteria have artfully and seamlessly implemented and integrated into each human being. Yet if bacteria are responsible for much of our smells, then it is primarily our lovers bacteria that most attracts us, isn't it? Or what may ultimately be even more decentering for a sense of self, since we may like reproduce with this person, is are we merely some kind of emotional puppets in a massive bacterial conspiracy to guide human passion and perhaps even direct human sexual selection, heredity, and evolution? That's a big question. And I thought with that, I would conclude with one of my favorite passages about scent ever. It's in a book by Patrick Suskind, a German author. And he writes, "In the period of which we speak, there reigned in the cities a stench barely conceivable to us modern men and women. The streets stank of manure, the courtyards of urine, the stairwells stank of moldering wood and rat droppings, the kitchens of spoiled cabbage and mutton fat, the unaired parlors stank of stale dust, the bedrooms of greasy sheets, damp feather beds, and the pungently sweet aroma of chamber pots. The stench of sulfur rose from the chimneys, the stench of caustic lies from the tanneries, and from the slaughterhouses came the stench of congealed blood. People stank of sweat and unwashed clothes. From their mouths came the stench of rotting teeth, from their bellies that of onions, and from their bodies, if they were no longer very young, came the stench of rancid cheese and sour milk and tumorous disease. The rivers stank, the marketplaces stank, the churches stank. It stank beneath the bridges and in the palaces. The peasant stank, as did the priest, the apprentice, as did the master's wife. The whole of the aristocracy stank. Even the king himself stank like a rank lion, and the queen like an old goat, summer and winter. For in the 18th century, there's nothing to hinder bacteria busy at decomposition. And so there's no human activity, either constructive or destructive, no manifestation of germinating or decaying flesh that was not accompanied by stench." This is actually a rather dark story about a serial murdering, super smelling connoisseur, but it's fascinating if you're interested in scent. Working on labor, I became crazily attuned to my scents and the scents of others. Not our static scents, but how they change under different conditions and emotional states. certainly in the age of COVID, we're continually reminded and perhaps repulsed by the odor of others, and even our own breath clinging to the pores of our masks. I believe the scent of other people initially arouse a kind of disgust, as they're the very borders of what we think of self are transgressed by an aromatic cloud of otherness. Yet there's also a comfort and a nostalgia in these scents. The scents seem to me like a range of very complex communications that leaves me wanting to better understand the strange human and microbial co-production of humanness and our individual identities. Thanks.